Hi and welcome back. In this video we're talking about JSON files. JSON is probably one of the most, if not the most, popular format for data in the world. Especially extremely popular for web applications, and that's because JSON comes from the most popular web language, JavaScript. Indeed, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Here's what some JSON could look like. You've got some sort of curly braces at the start and at the end. Then you've got a key. Around it, there are double quotation marks, that's important. And then you've got a colon, and you can have a value associated with that key. Does it remind you of anything in Python? I hope that it reminds you of a dictionary, because it looks pretty similar to a dictionary. In fact, it looks the same as a dictionary. There are just a couple of differences between JSON, that is this thing here, and a Python dictionary. The first and most important difference is something you have to remember whenever you deal with JSON, and that is that JSON is a string. Notice how this piece of JSON here is inside a text file. And what are the contents of text files? That's correct. All the contents of text files are strings, as we saw when we read our CSV file, and as we saw when we read our plain old data file. Text files always contain strings only. When we read this, it will be a string, and we will convert it into a Python dictionary. The second difference is that JSON must always use double quotation marks and not single quotation marks. So if you do this, which is perfectly valid in Python, it will not be valid JSON, so don't do that. And some programs that read and write JSON require that the outermost element here, the outermost construct, the outermost structure, be an object. This thing here that we call a dictionary in Python is an object in JavaScript. They're very similar. When talking about JSON, the structure with these curly braces, we call it an object, because that's what it's called in JavaScript. I know that in Python they're called dictionaries. Some programs, however, and that's important, don't have this requirement. So in some programs, you could have a file called friends.json.txt that is just this. And this would be okay for some programs. And notice how the indentation here is slightly off. Let me fix it real quick. This would be okay for some programs, but not others. Some have the requirement that the outermost structure be an object, that's a dictionary. Some do not have this requirement, and this would be fine. For our example, we are going to stick with our object as the outermost structure. So let's read some JSON using Python. Python comes with a built-in module that you can import and use called the JSON module. We're going to talk a lot more about importing as we move on in this section. We're going to be importing our own files and modules as well as system modules. So let's start with importing the JSON module. But before we import the JSON module itself, let's talk a little bit about importing. The first thing I'm going to do is create a new file that I'm going to call something like JSON imports. Important, do not call this file JSON, because the JSON module already exists in Python. We're going to import it like so. So if you call your file JSON, that's going to confuse Python. Try to not have your files or any of your packages named after something that already exists in Python, or indeed try not to have duplicate names for files and things like that. Just a general piece of advice there. So in Python, as we've done a couple of times before in the course, sort of glanced over it, we can import things. And these things are code that other developers have written so that we don't have to write it ourselves. And now we're importing the JSON module, which contains some functions that allow us to import the JSON file and convert it into a dictionary, and also to go the other way around, turn a dictionary into JSON data. Remember, JSON data is very much like a dictionary, but it is a string. And remember that someone did write this JSON module in the same way that we are writing this file, and somebody wrote all the other built-in functions in Python, like len, or sum, or even like things like print. All of these have been written by someone. and they are made available to us to use globally in all our Python files. The only difference is that this JSON module is not included by default on all your files because whoever created Python thought that it may not be necessary in all cases. So the JSON module is a module that comes with Python, but it is not a global module. We must make it explicit that we want to use it by importing it at the top of the file like so. So we've created a file that contains our friends as JSON, and notice how this is a friends key, and that is associated with a list, and that contains 3 objects inside of it. I'm going to try really hard to call these objects when I'm talking about JSON and dictionaries when I'm talking about Python, but please bear with me if I do make any mistakes. These are objects in JSON.